I was in the middle of writing the script for last episode on Tuesday when the news broke that the Colorado Supreme Court had ruled that Donald Trump is something called an insurrectionist and is thus precluded from having his name appear on the Colorado ballot, either in the Republican primary or in the general election. According to the court's exceedingly novel, some might say stupendously idiotic and obviously corrupt interpretation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And I want to wait for the main segment before we get into the detailed analysis of just how legally incoherent and ethically dubious this action was that was undertaken by Colorado's High Court. Weed is legal in Colorado, so it's possibly we should be applying that sobriquet in its most literal possible sense. And trust me, the analysis will be very detailed indeed. But here in the open, I want to talk about an entirely different mode of ignorance and stupidity, and maybe where the dividing line is between the one and the other, because across the whole media landscape, both from the bought and paid for left-wing fake news performance artists and the conservative commentators who really ought to know better, in the last couple days since this decision was handed down, we've heard everybody mention the court's stated rationale, which again is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, but amazingly, that seems to be where all discussion of that section and that amendment ends. Now, in the case of the left-wing fake news performance artists, I think it's nearly always a safe bet to assume they do know the rest of the story, and they're either outright lying or intentionally omitting pertinent facts in pursuit of their only raison d'etre, which, of course, is to advance the political interests of the Democrat Party. But for the conservative chattering classes, when omitting the rest of the story is vindicative and quite possibly exculpatory for Donald Trump, then I see no alternative but to attribute that failure to actual, honest-to-God, crippling historical ignorance. Because here's the thing about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Does it preclude from public office any and all persons who have borne arms against the government of the United States? Yes. Yes, it does. But here's the part that everybody's either missing or leaving out on purpose. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was obviated and largely rendered a moot point entirely by the Amnesty Act of 1872. And what was contained in the Amnesty Act of 1872? Well, first it contained a blanket amnesty for all enlisted personnel and junior officers who served in the Confederate Armed Forces, and all former civil servants in the Confederate government, which is to say, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment no longer applied to any of them, provided they were willing to swear a loyalty oath and pledge never again to take up arms against the United States. For command-level Confederate officers and high-ranking government officials, they were eligible for the same amnesty under the same conditions, but the U.S. government retained the right to treat each of them on a case-by-case basis and to reject their petition with or without cause. And so, after 1872, many thousands of former Confederate personnel and officials went to work for the U.S. government. Many of them ran for office. Dozens of them wound up being elected to the House and the Senate, including some familiar names that you might find shocking. Foremost among them, Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, who was elected to the Senate, but the Senate refused to let him take his seat, which they were allowed to do back in the days before we had the god-awful, stupid 17th Amendment. But then he was elected to the House, where he was allowed to be seated, and reassumed the same seat he had held prior to the war. Who else is there? How about General Joe Johnston, commander of the Army of the Tennessee, whose capitulation to General Sherman marked the actual close of major hostilities in the Civil War, which happened a full 2 weeks after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Johnston applied for his personal amnesty, which he was required to do as a general officer, and it was granted. And he was later elected to Congress, where he served for one term. He died in 1891 after having overexerted himself, serving as a pallbearer for his old nemesis, General Sherman, because that is what national reconciliation looks like. And Stephens and Johnston, they're just two of many. And since we're on the subject, you want to know who authored and was the main proponent of the Amnesty Act of 1872? Senator Benjamin Butler. formerly General Benjamin Butler, who, to this very day in certain corners of Louisiana, is still referred to as the Brute. There are museums in New Orleans where you can still go and see chamber pots with General Ben Butler's face on them. And if you don't remember the story behind that, here it is. Butler was named military governor of New Orleans after the Union Army and Navy had completed their joint conquest of the Mississippi River and Delta. And the locals, they found his treatment of them to be, in their view, rather excessively harsh. So the women of the city developed a mode of civil disobedience whereby each morning they would dump out their chamber pots onto the heads of the Union soldiers who were patrolling the streets of the city, to which General Butler responded with the issuance of the infamous General Order 28, which said, quote, "As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town, plying her avocation." End quote. Now, why would a man like that, the most hated man in the Confederacy, who was happy to return that hatred in kind, be the author and the main proponent of an amnesty act a mere 7 years after the conclusion of the war? Because he understood, just like Joe Johnston understood, like a lot of people on both sides understood, that if we descended into a second civil war, we would not survive it. And if we excluded all former Confederates from government employment and public office, a second civil war would be exactly what we got, along with the permanent fracturing and balkanization of the North American continent. So men like Butler and Johnston spent the remainder of their lives promoting the cause of national reconciliation. And today's Democrat officials and left-wing activists are undoing all of that work for no better reason than to bolster their credibility with the woke social media race huckster class. After the passage of the Amnesty Act of 1872, there was really only one man to whom Section 3 of the 14th Amendment still applied, and that was Jefferson Davis himself. Davis never actually made his application, but he would have liked to run for Congress again, so he put some feelers out there, and it was made clear to him that this was one bridge of national reconciliation that just couldn't be crossed, that the people of the country simply wouldn't tolerate the President of the Confederacy returning to his old seat in the House of Representatives like nothing had ever happened. The Vice President, that's fine, but we gotta draw the line somewhere, Jeff. So I wonder if those 4 Democrat Party apparatchik judges on the Colorado Supreme Court realize they have just placed Donald Trump into a station nobody else has ever occupied except the actual president of the goddamn Confederate States of America. Actually, no, I don't wonder that. I know they don't realize it, and I know they wouldn't give a single goddamn if they did. Just like they don't give a damn that they've probably moved us closer to a second civil war than we have been at any point since the Compromise of 1876. And if that doesn't make you afraid of what's to come, it really ought to, because it scares the living shit out of me. From atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the combined effects of Biden inflation and climate hysteria mean misbehaving little boys and girls will be getting a shitty electric car in their stockings this year instead of a lump of coal. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And as many of you will have already heard by now, the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery is currently in the process of being unceremoniously torn down in continuance of the woke left-wing assault on all post-Civil War symbols of national reconciliation, of which at this point, there are a precious few remaining. And the wokesters, of course, they will tell you this is all about slavery and racism, but they're lying. Or they're ignorant fucktards who've never picked up a history book, one or the other, possibly both. The idea that every commemoration of the Confederacy is a monument to the cruelty of involuntary human servitude is one of the stupidest, most ahistorical ideas that has ever gained currency in this country, and that is really saying a lot. And the people in the rank and file of the woke rage mob, the people who get all their information about the world from TikTok videos, They don't know any better. To the extent they were ever taught history in the public schools they attended, it was 1 month of black history, 1 month of indigenous history, and 1 month of LGBTQIA history. Which is to say, they are a blank slate. You can make them do anything you want. All you have to do is say, that thing over there is racist, go destroy it. They don't know they are unwitting foot soldiers who are assaulting the whole idea of a pluralistic liberal democracy, but they are. But the people at the top, the puppet masters, they know exactly what they are doing. They know the Confederate Memorial at Arlington doesn't have any goddamn thing to do with glorifying slavery. They know they are waging open war upon the entire concept of national unity and reconciliation because they don't want to live in a country where unity and reconciliation are fashionable concepts. They want to live in a country where people like them, and only people like them, are in charge, permanently. And they want the message to be sent in no uncertain terms that if you stand in the way of their hegemony and their supremacy, you will be destroyed, crushed like a bug on a windshield. But they can't say any of that out loud, at least not yet. So they're doing the same thing with American democracy that they have done so successfully with nearly all of our cultural and business institutions. Infiltrate it, take it over, hollow it out into a convincing-looking skin suit, put it on yourself and use the previous credibility of the company or the institution and whatever public trust it used to enjoy, and use that veneer as a Trojan horse for the advancement of the aims of the woke leftist globalist project. So you take a brand like Disney, a 100-year-old brand that built its reputation on providing wholesome, family-friendly entertainment, probably the most trusted brand in U.S. history, and then infiltrate it, hollow it out, put on the skin suit, and use it as a sledgehammer with which to smash and destroy the nuclear family and trans the kids. And if you can do that with a brand like Disney, you can sure as shit do it with the U.S. government and our electoral system. They really like the pretense of democracy. They really like the veneer of democracy. It's why we always hear them vomiting out the phrase, our democracy, so incessantly and with such fake sincerity. But when they use that term, our democracy, what does it really mean underneath all the lies and obfuscation? Well, it certainly doesn't mean the thing you and I and most normal sane people think of when we think of the word democracy, which is allowing the people of the country to choose their own leaders through free and fair elections, in which each voter gets one vote and the only people casting the votes are either 1, registered voters, and 2, currently alive, preferably both. If the events of this week should disabuse every American of any notion, it is the notion that the term our democracy, when used in the parlance of our self-appointed overlords, means anything resembling actual democracy, because actual democracy, it's just too dangerous. In an actual democracy, the idiot voters might do some damn fool thing like electing Donald Trump to be president, like they did in 2016. We can't risk having that happen again. That would be an existential threat to the new woke world order we are trying so assiduously to build. We want the people to think they're living in a democracy, but we just can't risk allowing them to vote for the candidate they actually want. We need to create a perfect world where the populace believes our hollowed-out skin suit veneer of democracy is actual democracy, a world where every 4 years we offer them a false choice between 2 ossified, endemically corrupt corporate brands, the donkey brand and the elephant brand. We'll give them a choice between a hard-left Democrat and a compliant liberal Republican, whom we can trust not to rock the boat too much if he should happen to win. A John McCain or a Willard Romney or somebody like that. What we will not ever give them is the chance to elect an actual conservative who engages in crazy talk about returning power to the people, or heaven forbid, reducing the size and scope of the central government. It's just like that Google VP said in that employee seminar from 2017 that we only ever got to hear the tape of due to the invaluable efforts of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. And she said, we didn't do enough to stop this, meaning the election of Donald Trump, and we won't let that happen again. So if you're looking for a tidy explanation for the actual motivations of what happened in Denver on Tuesday, That's the tidiest one this host knows how to give. But now let's get into how and why this was quite possibly the most absurd event, the most legally indefensible ruling in the entire 234-year-long history of American jurisprudence. Or at least since that Simi Valley jury ruled that O.J. didn't kill Ron and Nicole. But I digress. In the simplest possible layman's terms, here's what the court ruled. That the sitting president of the United States committed an act of insurrection against his own government by telling a group of his supporters to go to the Capitol and engage in a peaceful, patriotic protest, which, in the learned opinion of the Colorado court, is exactly the same thing as being Jefferson Davis and leading an actual government of an armed insurrection in a 4-year-long orgy of bloodletting that resulted in the deaths of 750,000 Americans. That's the moral equivalency that the Colorado Supreme Court has chosen to draw. And they want you to not laugh at them, because apparently they think you're as stupid as they are. In other words, 4 activist judges in Colorado have declared that because Donald Trump said some words they don't like, he is an insurrectionist on the same level as Jefferson goddamn Davis. And he has committed a crime so heinous, so severe, that the people of Colorado should be deprived of their most basic right in a functioning democracy, the right to vote for the candidate of their choosing. But wait, I hear you say, since when can a judge simply declare a man guilty of a criminal offense with which he has never been charged or tried, much less convicted? Unclear. And furthermore, I hear you say, what jurisdiction does a Colorado judge possibly have over the perceived speech crimes that were committed by a man in Washington, D.C.? Again, unclear. Your guess is as good as mine, frankly. I've read the opinion in its entirety a couple of times, in fact, and I am no closer to divining the rationale whereby they are getting from point A to point B to point C. But then, I don't have a fancy law degree from some fancy Ivy League institution, so what the hell do I know anyway? But does this decision even merit the level of serious analysis that we are giving it right now? No, of course it doesn't. I've probably put more thought into it than any of the 4 of these assholes did. You can boil their whole thought process and their rationale down to 10 words. Orange man bad, orange man disqualified, our side wins. Hooray! Is it horrifying to consider that this is actually where we are now? Yes, it sure as hell is. A Rubicon has been crossed here that no judge or court in our history has ever even contemplated crossing, and the results, I fear, will be terrible beyond the imagining of even the most ardent pessimist. Now, it goes without saying that when the U.S. Supreme Court takes up the case next week, it's going to get left out of the room with extreme prejudice, and I, for one, am looking very much forward to a no-punches-pulled smackdown of a majority opinion from Justice Thomas. In a sane world, well, let me take that back. Because in a sane world, no state Supreme Court would ever do a thing like this. But in a semi-sane world, this should be a 9-0 shutout that takes about 5 minutes of deliberation amongst the justices. But we know that's not going to happen. We know the best case scenario is 7-2. Because we know Justice Sotomayor and Justice Brown Jackson were installed on the court for one reason, and one reason only. To be reliable rubber stamps for the interest of the Democrat Party. Which is the exact same reason these 4 judges were installed on the Colorado Supreme Court. Just rule the way we need you to rule and backfill the legal rationale to the best of your ability. There is absolutely no version of reality where Sotomayor and Brown Jackson would ever rule against the interests of the Democrats. But just take a moment to consider what might happen if you flipped 1 or 2 seats on the U.S. Supreme Court. The Colorado decision would be upheld, and then Trump would be thrown off the ballot in every state that the Democrats control. And American democracy would be well and truly dead as a fucking doornail. We are walking on the knife edge of anarchy here, and the people who are doing this stuff just to be team players, I don't think they really have any comprehension of the forces that their actions have the potential to unleash. One wishes that Ben Butler and Joe Johnston were around to give them a nice slap in the face and a good talking to. Thanks very much indeed for watching. See you Sunday. Blast Radius. Christmas Eve, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. No promises, but I might have a new song ready to debut live and without a net. Until then, have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn!